Dr. Matson here again. So this one will cover all about caffeine, again, part of its history and affects different types of caffeine that we use. So let's get started. On a daily basis, more people use caffeine than any other psychoactive drug. Many use it regularly, and there is evidence for dependence and some evidence that regular use can interfere with the very activities people believe that it helps them with. Okay, so looking at a little bit of the history here, uh, whatever the actual origin of human coffee use, the practical spread to Egypt and other Arabic countries by the 1400s through Middle East by the 1500s and into Europe into the 1600s. So we have coffee houses that began appearing in England in 1650, France in 1671, and a new era began. Coffee houses were all things to all people. They were a place to relax, to learn the news of the day, to seal bargains, and to plot. Women in England argued against the use of coffee in 1674 in a pamphlet entitled The Women's Petition Against Coffee, representing to public consideration the grand inconveniences accruing to their sex from the excessive use of the drying and enfeebling liquor. The women claimed men used too much coffee, and as a result, the men were as unfruitful as those deserts whence that unhappy berry is said to be brought. Coffee use expanded as the West was won, and per capita consumption increased steadily in the early 1900s. But even after the prohibition went away, coffee consumption continued to rise, and in 1946, annual per capita coffee consumption reached an all time high of 20 pounds. Americans now drink about half that much coffee per year, and the wide variety of soft drinks, energy drinks, and bottled water have apparently replaced coffee as the most popular non alcoholic beverages. If the national drink is not as national as it once was, it's not really as simple either. Caldi and his friends were content to simply munch on the coffee beans or put them in hot water. But somewhere in the dark past, the Middle East discovered that roasting the green coffee bean improved the flavor, aroma, and color of the drink made from the bean. For years, housewives, storekeepers, and coffee house owners bought the green bean, then roasted and ground it just before use. Commercial roasting started in 1790 in New York City, and the process gradually spread through the country. Vacuum packing of ground coffee was introduced in 1900, a process that maintains the quality until the seal is broken. Looking at trade, the coffee growing spread worldwide, and when the Dutch began cultivation in the East Indies in 1696, different variations of the coffee tree and different growing and processing conditions provided many opportunities for varying the characteristics of the coffee. So there's been a lot of bean producing shrubs, and virtually all coffee is made from two species, the Arabica and the Robusta. The Arabica beans have a milder flavor, take longer to develop after planting, and require a near tropical climate to grow. And therefore, they're more expensive and more desirable for most purposes. The Robusta beans have a stronger and more bitter flavor and a higher caffeine content and are used primarily in less expensive blends as well as to make instant coffee. In some countries, such as Colombia, the Arabica beans are grown, whereas Brazil, the world's largest coffee producer, produces both kinds. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 2020, Brazil produced twice as much coffee as Vietnam, which is the second biggest coffee growing country. Colombia and Indonesia were next and followed by Mexico and Central America. So, working to remove the caffeine from the bean, beginning in the early 1970s, health conscious Americans began to drink more decaffeinated coffee and less regular coffee. There are several ways of removing caffeine from the coffee bean. In the process used by most American companies, the unroasted beans are soaked in an organic solvent, raising concerns about the residue of the solvent remaining in the coffee. The Swiss water process, which is not used on a large commercial scale in the US, removes more of the coffee's flavor. The caffeine that is taken out of the coffee is used mostly in soft drinks. There are so many options these days for types of coffee. You have your pure Colombian, French roast, decaf, half calf, flavored, instant mixes, even cold brew coffee beverages. The number of specialty coffee shops increased from fewer than 200 back in 1989 to more than 35,000 in 2019, and that number continues to rise. When we start to examine the origins of tea and take a look deeper into the history of where it began, the first report of tea that seems to be a reliable idea is that it's in a Chinese manuscript, and this dates back to AD 350 when it was primarily seen as a medicinal plant. Then, in non-medical use of tea, it is suggested by an AD 780 book on the cultivation of tea, but the real proof that it was in wide use in China is that a tax was levied on it in the same year. And before this time, the Buddhist monks had carried the cultivation and use of tea to Japan. So 50 years later, in 1610, the Dutch delivered the first tea to the continent of Europe. And then in 1600, the English East India Company was formed, and Queen Elizabeth gave the company a monopoly on everything from the east coast of Africa across the Pacific to the west coast of South America. And as the market for tea increased, the English East India Company expanded its imports of tea from China. Coffee had arrived first, so most tea was sold in coffee houses. And then with the patrons of taverns off at coffee houses kind of living it up with tea, coffee, and chocolate, the tax revenues from alcoholic beverages declined. And then Britain banned Dutch imports of tea in 1669, which gave the English East India Company a monopoly. Profit from the China tea trade colonized India, and it brought about the Opium Wars between China and Britain, and then induced the English to switch from tea to coffee. The American colonies, ever loyal to the king, had become big tea drinkers, which helped the king and the East India Company stay solvent. These measures made the colonists unhappy over paying taxes that they had not helped formulate, so taxation without representation. And then in 1767, this resulted in a general boycott on the consumption of English tea. And so coffee use increased, but the primary increase was in the smuggling of the tea. Several boatloads of this tea, which would be sold cheaper than any before, sailed towards various ports in the colonies. And then the American merchants who would not have made any profit on this tea were the primary ones who rebelled at the cheap tea. Some ships were turned away from the port, but the beginning of the end came with the 342 chests of tea that turned the Boston harbor into a teapot on the night of December 16th, 1773. So I'm sure you're familiar with the Boston Tea Party. The annual per capita consumption of tea in the United Kingdom is about 4.5 pounds, led only by Turkey and Ireland. Tea starts its life on a 4 to 5 foot bush high in the mountains of China, Sri Lanka, India, or Indonesia. And if it's unpruned, the bush would grow into a 15 to 30 foot tree, which would be difficult to pluck, as picking tea leaves is called. The pluckers select only the bud leaf and the first 2 leaves at each new growth. Plucking is done every 6 to 10 days in warm weather as new growth develops on the many branches. The leaves are then dried. They're rolled to crush the cells in the leaf and then placed in a cool, damp place for fermentation or oxidation to occur. Non-oxidized leaves are packaged and sold as green tea, and sales of which have seen large increases in recent years. Oxidized tea is called black tea and accounts for about 84% of the tea Americans consume. And then oolong tea is greenish brown and consisting of partially oxidized leaves At the Louisiana's Purchase Exposition in St. Louis in 1904, we introduced iced tea, which was sold for the first time. And iced tea now accounts for 85% of all tea consumed in America. Most tea is sold in tea bags these days, but instant teas, some containing flavorings and sweeteners, are popular more for convenience. Flavored teas, which contain mint, spices, or other substances, along with tea, offer other options. The biggest boom in recent years has been in the so-called herbal teas, which mostly contain no real tea. These teas are made up of mixtures of other plants, uh, leaves, and flowers for both flavor and color, and they've become quite popular among people who avoid caffeine. So theophylline is what we look at here, and this is present in only very small or non-pharmacological amounts in tea. And although tea contains this chemical, uh, like I said, it's present in only very small amounts in the beverage. It's very effective at relaxing the bronchial passages, and it's often prescribed for use by asthmatics. All right, so looking a little bit at the history of chocolate, long before Columbus landed on San Salvador, the Aztec god of the air gave humans a gift from paradise, which is the chocolate tree. The Aztecs treated it as such, and the cacao bean was an important part of their economy, with the cacao bush being cultivated widely. The chocolat from the Mayan words choco, which is warm, and latl, which is beverage, was flavored with vanilla but was far from the chocolate of today. The Cortez introduced sugarcane plantations to Mexico in the early 1520s and supported the continued cultivation of the Thebroma cacao bush. When he returned to Spain in 1528, Cortez carried with him cakes of processed cocoa. Although chocolate was introduced to Europe almost a century before, coffee and tea, its use is started to spread, but spread very slowly. Until 1828, all chocolate sold was a relatively indigestible substance obtained by grinding the cacao kernels after processing. The preparation had become more refined over the years, but it still followed the Aztec procedure of letting the pods dry in the sun, then roasting them before removing the husks to get to the kernel of the plant. The result of the grinding for the kernels is a thick liquid called chocolate liqueur, and this is a baking chocolate. In 1828, a Dutch patent was issued for the manufacture of the chocolate powder, and by removing about two-thirds of the fat from the chocolate liqueur, the fat was removed. Cocoa butter became important when someone found that if it's mixed with sugar and some of the chocolate powder, then it could be easily formed into slabs or bars. So this is where the chocolate bar was born. And so in 1847, the first chocolate bars appeared, but it was not until 1876 that the Swiss made their contributions to the chocolate industry by inventing milk chocolate, which was first sold under the Nestle label. And by FDA standards, milk chocolate today must contain at least 12% milk solids, although better grades contain almost twice that amount. So the xanthine or the unique xanthine in chocolate is the theobromine, and its physiological actions closely parallel those of caffeine, but it's much less potent in its effects on the central nervous system. The average cup of cocoa contains about 200 milligrams of theobromine, but only 4 milligrams of caffeine. When we look at other sources of caffeine, we've got soft drinks, energy drinks, over the counter drugs. There's quite a variety of other ways that we can use caffeine in other products. So in soft drinks, we go from this from a green nerve tonic in 1886 in Atlanta, Georgia, that did not sell well at all. And Coca-Cola has grown into the real thing, providing the pause that refreshes, selling almost 3 billion cases a year and operating in more than 200 countries. Dr. J.C. Pemberton's green nerve tonic in the late 1800s contained caramel fruit, flavoring phosphoric acid, caffeine, and a secret mixture called merchandise number 5. Coca-Cola was touted as the new and popular fountain drink containing the tonic properties of the wonderful cocoa plant and the famous cola nut. In 1903, the company admitted its beverage contained small amounts of cocaine, but soon after, it quietly removed all the cocaine. A government analysis of Coca-Cola in 1906 did not find any sources or traces of it. In 1916, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the lower court by rejecting the charge of misbranding, stating that the company had repeatedly said that certain extracts from the leaves of the cocoa shrub and the nut kernels of the cola tree were used for the purpose of obtaining a flavor, and that the ingredients containing these extracts with the cocaine eliminated was called merchandise number 5. So today, coca leaves are imported by a pharmaceutical company in New Jersey. The cocaine is extracted for medical use, and the decocomanized leaves are shipped to the Coca-Cola plant in Atlanta, where merchandise number 5 is produced. And then in 1981, the FDA changed its rules so that a cola no longer has to contain caffeine. If it does contain caffeine, it may not be more than 0.02%, which is 0.2 milligrams, or a little less than 6 milligrams per ounce. Although more soft drinks are consumed in the U.S. than in any other country, per capita consumption of soft drinks has declined a bit from its maximum of 50 gallons per capita to about 45. And this is due to the competition from energy drinks as well as from bottled water. So looking at some energy drinks, some consumers have always preferred to obtain their caffeine from soft drinks instead of from coffee. This led to the development and promotion of Jolt Cola, which had the maximum allowable caffeine content per ounce, or almost 72 milligrams in a 12-ounce can. Then along came the Austrian sensation in a small can, which is Red Bull, touted as an energy drink, and the main active ingredient in this expensive drink is caffeine at 80 milligrams per 8.3 ounce can, but it's still less than a cup of coffee. And then we also have over-the-counter drugs, which is presumably many more people who buy alertness tablets such as NoDoz are aware that they are buying caffeine, but many buyers of such things as Excedrin might not realize how much caffeine they are getting. So looking a little bit more at the xanthines, we've got caffeine, theophylline, and theobromine. And so xanthines are the oldest stimulants. Xanthine is a Greek word meaning yellow, the color of the residue that remains after xanthines are heated, and the nitric acid until dry. And so the 3 xanthines of primary importance are the caffeine, the theophylline, and the theobromine. So in humans, the absorption of caffeine is rather rapid after oral intake, and peak blood levels are reached 30 minutes after ingestion. And the half-life of caffeine in humans is about 3 hours, and no more than 10% is excreted or unchanged. Cross-tolerance exists among the methylated xanthines, which is loss of tolerance, can take more than 2 months of abstinence. So dependence on caffeine is very real. Various experiments have reported on the reinforcing properties of caffeine in regular coffee drinkers, and one of the most clear-cut studies allowed patients on a research board to choose between 2 coated instant coffees, identical except that one contained caffeine. There has been long, clear evidence of physical dependence on caffeine as well, and the most reliable withdrawal is sign of a headache, which occurs on average of 18 to 19 hours after the most recent caffeine intake. In the early 1980s, evidence was presented that caffeine and the other xanthines blocked the brain receptors for a substance known as adenosine. This is a neurotransmitter or a neuromodulator. And adenosine normally acts in several areas of the brain to produce behavioral sedation by inhibiting the release of other neurotransmitters. So caffeine stimulant action results from blocking the receptors for this inhibitory effect. The pharmacological effects on the CNS and the skeletal muscles are probably the basis for the wide use of caffeine-containing beverages. This CNS stimulation is also the basis for coffee nerves, which can occur at low doses in sensitive individuals and in others when they have consumed large amounts of coffee. In the absence of tolerance, even 200 milligrams will increase the time it takes to fall asleep and will cause sleep disturbances. So if you're having trouble sleeping at night, cut off the caffeine by 2 p.m. is the suggested, or it's really 8 hours before you're ready to go to bed. But we say 2 p.m. on average. There is a strong relationship between the mood elevating effect of caffeine and the extent to which it will keep the individual awake. So caffeine acts directly on the vascular muscles to cause dilation, whereas stimulation of the autonomic centers results in constriction of blood vessels. Usually dilation occurs, but in the brain the blood vessels are constricted, and this constriction might be the basis for caffeine's ability to reduce migraine headaches. When regular users of high amounts of caffeine, which is more than 300 milligrams a day, which is the equivalent of 3 cups of brewed coffee, were tested on a variety of study-related mental tasks without caffeine, they performed more poorly than did users of low amounts, perhaps because of withdrawal effects. High consumption of either coffee or energy drinks among college students has been associated with lower academic performance. So there is considerable evidence that 200 to 300 milligrams of caffeine will partially offset fatigue-induced decrement in the performance of motor tasks. Caffeine's vasoconstrictive effects are considered to be responsible for the drug's ability to relieve headaches. Studies indicate that caffeine-containing and analgesics are beneficial in reducing headache pain in either migraine or tension headaches. So as for migraine headaches, in 1998, the FDA allowed the relabeling of extra-strength Excedrin, which contains 65 milligrams of caffeine for over-the-counter use as Excedrin migraine. Many studies have looked at the effect of caffeine on the behavior of children diagnosed with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and the results have been inconsistent. And caffeine will not lower blood alcohol concentration, but it might arouse the drinker. Although there is not yet a clear evidence that moderate caffeine consumption is dangerous, the scientific literature has investigated the possible effects of caffeine in cancer, benign breast disease, reproduction, as well as heart disease. Part of the problem in knowing for certain about some of these things is the research on caffeine consumption is difficult to do well because of the many sources of caffeine and the variability of caffeine content in coffee. In the early 1980s, there was an increased risk of pancreatic cancers reported among coffee drinkers. However, studies since then have criticized procedural flaws in that report and have found no evidence of such a link. In the 1984 American Cancer Society, the nutritional guidelines indicated there is no reason to consider caffeine a risk factor in human cancer. And with reproductive effects, although studies in pregnant mice have indicated that very large doses of caffeine can produce skeletal abnormalities in the pups, studies on humans have not found a relationship between caffeine and birth defects. Although there continues to be concern about reduced fertility with heavy caffeine consumption, the quality of the evidence is somewhat weak. However, the best advice for a woman who wants to become pregnant, stay pregnant, and produce a strong, healthy baby is to avoid caffeine, alcohol, tobacco, and any other drug that is not absolutely necessary for her health. And I read this other study on women in Denmark who consumed 8 cups of coffee or more, and I'm guessing with Denmark, the cup is probably not the size of a 1 cup that you're thinking here in the States. It's probably a much smaller amount, maybe 4 ounces would be considered a cup. I don't know, the study didn't give me the specifics. But the effects that they were finding in the women that consumed at least 8 cups of coffee during their pregnancy was they were seeing a lower birth weight. They were seeing more cases of stillborn babies. And so a lot of times when we look at drugs and alcohol, we put caffeine in that kind of grouping. And basically, women should avoid any kind of drugs, period, whether it's caffeine, alcohol, or any of the hardcore narcotics, even over the counters. All of that should be avoided during pregnancy unless used under a doctor's supervision, because we do tend to see more effects to the babies once they're born, or even the developing fetus when a woman is, using any of these drugs. So there's definitely some conflicting research out there on that. Heart disease, we also look at. There's many reasons for believing that caffeine might increase the risk of heart attacks, including the fact that it increases heart rate and blood pressure. The latest research then says that 2 or 3 cups of coffee per day is okay, but 4 or 5 or more, that increases the risk of heart attack. So this is of special concern to those with other risk factors such as smoking, family history of heart disease, obesity, high blood pressure, and high cholesterol levels. Uh, Caffeine is not terribly toxic, and overdose deaths are extremely rare. An estimated 10 grams, equivalent to 100 cups of coffee, would be required to cause death from caffeine taken by mouth. However, caffeineism, which is excessive use of caffeine, can cause a variety of unpleasant symptoms, and because of caffeine's domesticated social status, it might be overlooked as the cause. For example, nervousness, irritability, tremors, muscle twitching, insomnia, flushed appearance, and elevated temperature can all result from excessive caffeine use. There can also be palpitations, heart arrhythmias, and gastro disturbances as well. So just be mindful, monitor your intake of caffeine. If you engage in it, just watch the amount that you do and try not to overdo it. Like anything else in life, right? Moderation is key.